Hey, welcome back, class, to another unit on political science. And this week, I think, is a really fun topic. We're going to be diving in to the media. Now, you might have started this class and you never really thought or talked about politics before. A lot of students do that. Some of you are really into it. Some of you haven't really spent much time thinking about it. No matter what, I can guarantee that a lot of you guys know about this topic, the media, because you all use it in your everyday lives. And so we're going to be talking about the media this week. You got to see a smartphone right here. And that, of course, is an indication of some of the stuff that's to come. Now, we're going to be talking about all kinds of different types of media this week, and smartphone is no exception to that. In fact, that's actually what I chose as this week's picture. I like to start off the week with a photo. And here you see somebody eating a little meal. Maybe they're having breakfast in the morning. They got their tablet, they got their iPhone out. And now, if I'd have done a lecture on the media years ago, I might have shown you a picture of a newscast anchor sitting behind a desk with a big fancy camera pointed at them, because TV was the name of the game. But so much has changed with the introduction of smartphones in terms of the way we consume media, the way that we interact with the media. You can even be the media if you want. You can record something that's happening, post it to social media, and before you know it, it is a news story that's being covered all over the country. Of course, we've seen instances of that happening in recent history. So definitely a lot of changes that have been happening in the media landscape. Now, here's what we're going to do to get started. We're going to be talking about what is the media. When we talk about media, we better understand what that is. And so our goals for this video are to do a few things. Number one, we're going to define the term media. What does that topic actually mean? What is the topic that we're focusing on this week? Next, we're going to just do a bird's eye view of some of the big popular types of media sources. Now, we're going to get into the specifics on each of these later on in the lectures. I'm going to kind of go in by detail, one by one, and we're going to look at all of these. But in this video, we're going to get a bird's eye view of what's to come. We're also going to look at generational differences. Now, if I asked you right now, where do you get your news? A lot of you would maybe say, well, I go on social media, or I turn on CNN, cable news. Maybe I go onto a website, or I listen to the radio. There's going to be a lot of different ways that Americans consume their news. And what we find as well is that there's generational differences. Young people tend to get their news sources from a different place than older people. So we're going to look at that. And then finally, we're going to end with a little bit of a longer discussion on what are some of the functions of the media. Like, why do we even have a media in the first place, and why is it important for democracy? So buckle up. That's the stuff that we're going to talk about in this video. And why don't we just dive right in right now in terms of defining what the media is. So when I say this term media, you probably already have a good sense of what I'm talking about. Maybe you like to watch TV, or you like to listen to music on the radio, or maybe even every once in a while you'll pick up a newspaper and read it. The term media talks about all of that. So when I'm talking about the media, I'm talking about methods that we have for communicating with each other. We can communicate stories. We can communicate ideas. The media are essentially the platforms that allow us to do that, to communicate ideas out into the world, to share stories with each other. And there's going to be different platforms that we use to do that. You can use the airwaves if you're broadcasting something over the TV or the radio. Or you can use printed media, things like newspapers, magazines, books. All of that stuff counts. Now, we're going to be focusing this week on the mass media. And when I say mass media, I'm talking about all of these platforms that allow you to get your message out to a lot of people. So that could be newspapers and radio. It could also be things like Twitter and TikTok and Instagram. These are all ways that we can communicate with a lot of people all at once. You're watching this on YouTube right now. That's part of the media. It's part of the mass media. So here we are together engaging in the media. So that's our topic for the week. And there are some very important media sources out there. We can kind of look at this progression really as older sources of media going up through until more modern ones. So the earliest sources of media, that's going to be like the newspapers. And we're going to look at some examples from early in U.S. history, basically starting in the 1700s and into the 1900s. We're going to look at the role that newspapers played. We're also going to look at some of the reasons why newspaper readership has declined quite a lot in recent years. We're going to look at radio as well. Radio was a really important source of media for quite a long time. In fact, a lot of you still listen to the radio when you're driving around town. You might get some news, you might hear some great songs, but we'll take a look at how some politicians have used the radio over the years. Now, of course, all of us are familiar with television, and that was a huge revolution as well. So we're going to be looking at the way that TV changed politics, especially things like debates, and how the president can really get in touch with the American people and share ideas. Now, finally, the internet has really put everybody in the driver's seat. It used to be we would all sit at home and just passively watch what was on TV. Today, if you wanted to, you could get out your phone, record something, post it up for all your friends, and now you have an even bigger chance to really engage in the media yourself, to become the media, to produce content and put it out there. So the internet has really given people a lot of access that they didn't have before. We're going to be looking at that this week as well. So those are some of our big sources. Now, where do Americans get their news? Okay, so this was a poll that was taken a little while ago. It was back in 2018, so it's not the most recent. But when they asked at the Pew Research Center, where do Americans get their news, the most popular place was TV. So about 44% said that their primary source of news was watching TV. That could be like a broadcast news, cable news. Most Americans rated that as their number one. Just behind that was the internet at 34%. So media consumption patterns are changing quickly. More and more people are getting their information online through social media, through websites, through different apps. And so the internet is really, at some point, going to overtake TV as being the number one source of media. There are fewer people that get their news primarily from the radio. Some people do. There's you turn on radio stations right here in Los Angeles, and you'll find updates about what's going on in the world. So radio still does play a role, as well as print, maybe a magazine, maybe a newspaper. Now, not very many people are really regularly reading the newspaper anymore. So we'll talk a little bit in a next video about why that is. So you can see TV right now, at least in the recent past, is king, with internet kind of quickly getting a bigger and bigger source in terms of where Americans get their news. I like this poll a little bit better. And it's also more recent, and it's looking at Americans in terms of their media consumption patterns. Because, you can ask all Americans and say 44%, say TV. That doesn't really tell us much about how different groups are interacting with the media. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to break it out by age. And what we find is that older Americans and younger Americans, they differ pretty greatly in terms of where they get their media. So here you see a lady on the left. She looks older. She's got white hair. She's sitting there having a glass of wine, watching TV over her dinner. And then you have a young lady on the right-hand side. She's obviously much younger, and she's, looking at her smartphone. This is already going to give you a clue as to some of the differences that we see across different age groups. So in this poll that was administered by YouGov in 2022, they asked people, where did you get your news in the last week? And so these aren't going to add up to 100% because people could select multiple. And what you're seeing is with people over 65, the most popular source of news was TV, and cable TV in particular. These are going to be things like your Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. Those are your cable news stations. And of that age group, 56% said that they had gotten some news from that source within the last week. Newspapers and newspaper websites, say like your New York Times or your LA Times, those were accounted for about 1 in 5, and so did social media. So there were some seniors who were using social media, but it definitely was not the majority of seniors. So what did that look like for a younger generation? When we look at Americans 18 to 29, it's completely flipped. Most of the Gen Z, they're getting their media from social media. They're getting their news from sites like Instagram and Twitter and possibly even TikTok, right? They're getting their news from these different social media sites. And cable news viewership is not very high. It's less than 1 in 3 will have even seen something on cable news in the last week. So the big takeaway here is older Americans like to get their media primarily from TV sources. Younger Americans tend to get more and more of their media and their news from the internet, especially social media. If you want to dive in a little bit deeper, our textbook also shows this graph, which kind of says the same thing. Younger Americans more likely to get news online. Older Americans tend to go for those legacy news outlets such as cable news. So, why do we even have the media in the first place? In the next few minutes, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the reasons. And first and foremost is entertainment. When people will watch the media, they want to be entertained and have a good time. So, a lot of you've probably seen this movie, Encanto. The reason Disney made this movie was not to talk about politics or to share something about current events. It was just for you to have a good time, to go to the movies and see a good story. And so, definitely entertainment is going to be the number one purpose of the media. The vast majority of media we're watching is just to have fun. Now, there are some entertainment that can be political. So, say like a show like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, or say The Daily Show. Some of those shows maybe have a little bit of entertainment and they're also talking about politics. But for the most part, we're just watching shows that we like on TV. Or maybe we're listening to a really good song that we like. So entertainment, obviously important. Now, the next one is going to be reporting the news. Now, news anchors, obviously, they want to tell us what's happening. You can watch the news, you can learn a lot about what's happening in the world and what's happening in our country. Now, why is it important in a democracy to be aware of what's happening? Why do we need a good news, a good media and good news sources? Well, James Madison, who we've talked about in this class a lot, had a lot of stuff to say on the topic. And one of the things that he said was this quote here. He says, "A popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both." In other words, what he's saying is, in a democracy, if you don't have some way of getting good information, you're going to be in a pretty bad situation not too long in the future. He says, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." In other words, in a democracy, we, the people, we're the one calling the shots, and we want to be informed. We're going to be making important decisions. And if we're ignorant about the decisions that we're making, we're probably going to be in for a bad time. So James Madison was really a proponent of having a free press, making sure that people could get their ideas out there, to debate them, to be well informed, and to make good decisions. And it totally makes sense, right? James Madison, he was out there promoting the idea that we need to adopt a constitution. He was using newspapers to get his ideas out. And obviously, this would be a really important thing for him. He sees the power of the media to shape people's minds, their attitudes, their beliefs, and behaviors. And so, just like that, today, when we're making decisions about who's running the government and about what kind of things we should and shouldn't vote for, it's important to have good information so that we can make good decisions. Another important aspect of the media is socializing the new generation that comes up. We learned about political socialization earlier in the class. And it's true that the media that we watch when we're growing up teaches us about a lot of important values that we have in the country, how to treat other people, the way that democracy works, even things about our history. Sometimes I'll watch cartoons with my kids, and there will be, in the cartoon, George Washington is in there, and it's kind of a joke, and they're making fun of it and stuff, but they're actually learning a little bit about U.S. history, which is kind of cool too. So all of that stuff, it helps to socialize a new generation. It also helps us as a country to have a better sense of the places in our country. So for me, for instance, I've never been to New York City, but I feel like I know the city because I've watched shows like Friends and Brooklyn Nine-Nine and How I Met Your Mother, and I have a sense of things like Central Park and the different libraries and, the busy streets. I kind of have a sense of what it's like there, even though I've never been there. And the same is true of all kinds of places in the US. It makes me feel more connected to other places in our country as a citizen. Now, the media also plays an important role in terms of providing a political platform. Here you see in 2016, Donald Trump, as he was running for president, on one of these late night shows. He's got Jimmy Fallon here interviewing him. And, the late night shows, the media, all of this provides a place where people can come on and talk about politics, talk about their ideas, and really have this avenue for debate. And so we see this in the run up to elections, but it's also just, on different stories that we see. Sometimes you'll be watching maybe a show on Netflix and it will have some certain message that it's trying to get across to you. Or maybe you're watching on Hulu or something else. Maybe you even participate in the political debate by getting on Reddit or Twitter or TikTok and sharing your perspectives and your opinions. So providing a political platform is definitely an important part of the media as well. Now, all of these media companies that we're talking about, None of them do it just out of the goodness of their hearts or just because they want to make some good content. They're also motivated by profits. One of the biggest ways that media companies make profits is by selling advertisements. So they'll put the good content out there and you're going to see an ad. Maybe you're going to get a TV commercial for a medication or for a new car or something to clean your house with. The companies are going to sell that, they're going to make a profit, and they're really doing it with that purpose of being able to make money, which is an important part of the media as well that we'll talk about a little bit later in the class. So what have we done in this video? Well, first we defined what media is. We took a look at some of the different types of media, which we'll be exploring more in detail in the future. We also looked at the differences in generations. Some generations like some things, other generations get their news sources in other ways, so I want you to know the differences there. And then finally, we looked over a few of the reasons why we have the media in the first place. So we're going to end it here, and I'll see you on the next video where we're going to talk about some of the legacy and traditional types of media we've had in the country.